On a clear afternoon in Michigan, a woman stepped out of her car on the side of a busy highway, and in that single ordinary moment, her entire future quietly ended. Her name was Paige Marie Renkoski, and on May 24, 1990, she vanished in daylight, surrounded by passing vehicles, witnesses, and noise, yet she disappeared as if the world simply failed to notice. Her car engine was still running. Her purse was still inside the vehicle. Her shoes were carefully left behind. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no broken glass. There was no alarm raised. Paige was simply gone. This was not a crime hidden in darkness. This was not something that happened in isolation. This happened on Interstate 96 near Fowlerville, Michigan, one of the most traveled highways in the state, during the afternoon when traffic was steady and visibility was clear. That is what makes this story deeply unsettling, because it shows how easily a person can disappear even when others are close enough to see them. Welcome to Hidden Truth, the channel where real stories are told carefully, honestly, and with respect for the people at the center of them. Before you continue listening, subscribe to Hidden Truth, because stories like this are not fiction. They are documented, unresolved, and still waiting for answers. Paige Marie Renkoski was 30 years old. She was a substitute school teacher from Okemos, Michigan. She was engaged to be married. She had family who loved her, work responsibilities, and a future she was actively building. She was not known to be reckless. She was not known to disappear without explanation. Nothing about her past suggested she would walk away from her life. Multiple witnesses saw Paige standing beside her car speaking to two men next to a maroon-colored minivan. She appeared upset. One man placed his hand on her shoulder. To those passing by, it looked like a roadside problem or an emotional moment that did not require intervention. No one stopped. No one called for help. No one knew that this quiet interaction would become one of Michigan's longest-running cold cases. What followed was a series of missed signs, delayed decisions, and lost opportunities that would shape the case forever. Tonight on Hidden Truth, we tell Paige Renkoski's story in depth, not as rumors or speculation, but as a real documented case involving human choices and lasting consequences. Stay with this story until the end, because every detail matters, and sometimes the truth survives only when someone is willing to listen long enough. Before Paige Marie Renkoski became associated with a disappearance, an investigation, and decades of unanswered questions, she was living a structured and responsible life in Okemos, Michigan that reflected stability rather than chaos. Paige was born on February 2, 1960, and from an early age, she was described by those who knew her as dependable, thoughtful, and careful in how she approached her responsibilities. She did not seek attention. She did not live recklessly. She followed routines, valued family, and took her commitments seriously, which is reflected in her profession as a substitute school teacher, a role that demands reliability, trust, and consistency. Paige was the type of person schools relied on when they needed someone dependable, and she was known for showing up prepared and on time. At the time of her disappearance, Paige was engaged to be married, and while later reports confirmed that she had been experiencing relationship difficulties. This context is important because it shows a human reality rather than a motive for disappearance. Many people experience relationship stress without abandoning their lives, and those close to Paige consistently stated that she was not someone who would vanish without telling anyone. She maintained close contact with her family. She had employment responsibilities, and she had future plans that were actively in motion. There was no evidence of financial trouble, no history of running away, and no pattern of impulsive behavior that would suggest she intended to disappear. The morning of May 24, 1990, began as an entirely ordinary day for Paige. She drove her mother to Detroit Metropolitan Airport, a routine act of care that she had done before and that fit naturally into her daily life. There were no reports of unusual conversations, no visible distress, and no indication that Paige felt unsafe or threatened. After leaving the airport, she drove to Canton, Michigan to visit a friend, continuing her normal schedule without interruption. Nothing about this part of the day suggested it would be her last. Later that afternoon, between 2:30 and 2:45, Paige stopped at a small store located west of Interstate 275 in Canton. Although the store has since closed, the interaction inside it became a crucial piece of the timeline. Paige purchased a single beer, and the store clerk remembered her clearly due to her distinctive appearance. She was wearing loose-fitting, multicolored flower-patterned pants along with a noticeable necklace, clothing that stood out enough for the clerk to recall her later, without hesitation. This detail matters because it helped confirm Paige's identity and movements that day, grounding the timeline in verified observation rather than assumption. The beer Paige purchased was later found unopened inside her vehicle, which strongly suggests that she did not stop to drink and had continued with her plans after leaving the store. This detail reinforces the idea that Paige's day was unfolding normally and that she did not intend to linger or deviate from her routine. After leaving the store, Paige began driving west, and multiple witnesses later reported seeing her traveling along Interstate 96. There were no reports of erratic driving, no reports of distress signals, and no indication that she was seeking help at that time. At some point in the mid-afternoon, Paige's car came to a stop on the shoulder of Interstate 96 near Fowlerville, Michigan. Why she stopped remains unknown, and this unanswered question sits at the center of the mystery. There was no confirmed mechanical failure reported, and the vehicle showed no visible damage when it was later found. Several witnesses reported seeing Paige standing outside her car, speaking with two African-American men who were positioned beside a maroon-colored minivan parked nearby. Witnesses later stated that Paige appeared upset or emotionally distressed, though there were no signs of physical violence or force. One of the men was seen placing his hand on her shoulder, an action that some interpreted as comforting rather than threatening, which is one of the reasons the situation did not immediately raise alarm. To passing drivers, this scene appeared ordinary. It looked like a stranded motorist receiving help or someone experiencing an emotional moment on the roadside. No one stopped their vehicle. No one contacted emergency services. Traffic continued to move, carrying people forward while Paige remained behind. This brief roadside interaction is the last confirmed sighting of Paige Marie Renkoski. After this moment, there are no verified accounts of her movements. There are no confirmed conversations. There is no physical trace that clearly explains what happened next. An ordinary life, an ordinary day, and an ordinary decision to stop on the side of the road became the dividing line between a future that was expected and a mystery that remains unresolved. When Paige Marie Renkoski failed to return home on the evening of May 24, 1990, concern began to grow quietly among those who knew her, but what had already gone wrong hours earlier would soon shape the future of the entire case. Sometime after the roadside interaction near Fowlerville, Michigan, Paige's vehicle, a 1986 Oldsmobile Cutlass Calais, was discovered on the shoulder of Interstate 96, and at first glance, it did not look like the scene of a crime. The car was still running, its engine idling as if Paige had only stepped away for a moment and the doors were unlocked, giving the impression of abandonment rather than danger. Inside the vehicle, officers later noted that Paige's purse was still there along with her shoes, a detail that would later raise serious questions about what had happened, because it suggested that Paige did not leave her car with plans to travel far or disappear willingly. Despite these unusual details, the responding police officer believed the vehicle had been abandoned, and because of that assumption, the scene was not secured as a potential crime scene. No forensic perimeter was established. No immediate search of the surrounding area was conducted. The vehicle was simply towed away from the highway, removing it from the very place where critical evidence may have existed. At that moment, Paige Renkoski had not yet been officially reported missing, and earlier information suggested that she had been seen near her car around 3 in the afternoon, which further delayed urgency and contributed to the belief that there was no immediate threat. Hours passed before authorities realized that the situation was far more serious than it first appeared. By the time it became clear that Paige had not returned home and could not be located, the opportunity to preserve the original roadside scene had already been lost. The location where witnesses last saw her speaking with 2 men beside a maroon-colored minivan was no longer protected, and any physical evidence that may have existed there was exposed to traffic, weather, and time. When investigators later examined Paige's vehicle, they discovered several fingerprints and palm prints that did not belong to her. These prints were collected and entered into law enforcement databases, but no matches were found, leaving investigators with evidence that pointed to unknown individuals but no names to attach to it. Because the car had been moved and handled before it was recognized as part of a missing person case, investigators could never be certain whether all potential evidence had been preserved or whether some had been destroyed or contaminated. As news of Paige's disappearance spread, reports from the public began to emerge, adding complexity rather than clarity to the timeline. Several people claimed to have seen Paige driving west on Interstate 96 after the roadside encounter, raising the possibility that she may have left the scene on her own. One woman reported that she might have seen Paige at a highway rest stop kiosk, though this sighting could not be confirmed. 2 long-haul truck drivers also reported seeing a blonde woman matching Paige's description driving along the interstate, but like the other sightings, these accounts could not be verified with certainty. These reports created confusion for investigators because they suggested multiple possible paths Paige might have taken, while offering no definitive proof of her movements. Human memory is imperfect, especially when recalling brief encounters with strangers, and as time passed, the reliability of these sightings became increasingly difficult to assess. What remained undeniable, however, was that Paige's car had been left running on the side of the highway. Her personal belongings were still inside, and she herself had vanished without explanation. As investigators worked to reconstruct the events of that afternoon, the decision not to treat the vehicle as a crime scene came under scrutiny. In hindsight, the presence of Paige's purse and shoes inside the car suggested that she did not intend to leave voluntarily, and the fact that the engine was still running implied urgency or interruption rather than abandonment. These details, taken together, painted a picture of a situation that should have raised immediate concern, yet at the time, they were not enough to change the initial response. Paige's family soon learned how quickly a missing person case can lose momentum when early hours pass without decisive action. The first moments after a disappearance are often the most critical, and in this case, those moments slipped away quietly. As the investigation moved forward, detectives were forced to work backward, piecing together fragments of witness testimony, incomplete evidence, and unanswered questions, all while knowing that the original scene could never be revisited in its original state. What happened on the shoulder of Interstate 96 that afternoon may never be fully known, but one truth became clear as the investigation continued. The moment Paige Renkoski's car was towed away without suspicion marked the point at which the case became exponentially harder to solve. From that moment on, the search for Paige would be shaped not only by what was unknown, but by what had already been lost. As the days following May 24, 1990 turned into weeks, the investigation into the disappearance of Paige Marie Renkoski began to reveal how deeply the early delays had affected the search for answers. Once Paige was officially reported missing, investigators were forced to reconstruct her final hours using witness statements rather than preserved evidence, which immediately placed the case at a disadvantage. The roadside where Paige had last been seen speaking with two men beside a maroon-colored minivan was no longer a protected location, and whatever physical traces may have existed there had already been erased by traffic, weather, and time. Investigators focused heavily on witness accounts, but these accounts were fragmented and often conflicted with one another. Some individuals believed they had seen Paige driving west on Interstate 96 after the roadside encounter, while others were unsure of the timing or even the identity of the woman they observed. One woman reported a possible sighting of Paige at a highway rest stop kiosk, but there was no physical evidence to support the claim. Two long-haul truck drivers stated that they had seen a blonde woman matching Paige's description driving along the interstate, yet these sightings could not be independently verified and remained unconfirmed. As investigators attempted to piece together a timeline, it became clear that human memory was both essential and unreliable. Witnesses were recalling brief moments involving a stranger on a highway, often hours or days after the fact, which made exact details difficult to confirm. Despite these challenges, one detail remained consistent across multiple reports. Paige had been seen on the shoulder of the highway with two men and a maroon-colored minivan shortly before her disappearance. Attention then turned to Paige's personal life, including her engagement and reported relationship difficulties. Authorities confirmed that Paige and her fiancé had been experiencing problems, but after questioning and review, he was ruled out as a suspect. There was no evidence linking him to her disappearance and no indication that Paige had planned to meet anyone else that day. This ruling narrowed the investigation but also reinforced the uncertainty surrounding what had happened on the highway. As months passed without answers, the case slowly lost public visibility, though it never completely disappeared from law enforcement attention. Years later, investigators revisited the evidence and publicly acknowledged new developments. In 2009, detectives revealed that they had identified 6 potential suspects connected to the case. One of these individuals had been murdered in Detroit in 1999, eliminating any possibility of questioning him. Although his name was not released, investigators noted that he had once owned a burgundy minivan, similar to the one described by witnesses on the day Paige vanished. This detail reignited interest in the case, but without physical evidence or witnesses willing to come forward, it did not lead to charges. The fingerprints and palm prints found in Paige's vehicle remained unmatched, serving as silent reminders that unknown individuals had been present but could not be identified. Advances in forensic technology offered hope, yet without new material to analyze, progress remained limited. In 2011, investigators pursued new leads that suggested Paige's remains might be hidden in rural areas near where she disappeared. In May of that year, authorities searched a pond in Handy Township after a woman reported seeing cement-covered boots in the area around the time of Paige's disappearance. Ground-penetrating radar was used in the search, but nothing was recovered, and the mystery deepened further. Later that same year, A more unsettling development emerged when the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined state and local police in a dig operation in Conway Township. Cadaver dogs had alerted investigators to a specific property, and the search was based on a 1999 case file that included a hand-drawn map indicating that Paige Renkoski's remains were buried there. Despite the disturbing implications of this information, the excavation did not uncover any remains, leaving investigators with another dead end and more unanswered questions. Over time, law enforcement reached a painful conclusion. Even without a body, the circumstances of Paige's disappearance strongly suggested homicide. Her case was officially ruled a homicide, though no one was charged and no arrests were made. The Livingston County Sheriff Department cold case team continued to review the evidence, but the passage of time made every lead harder to pursue. Decades after Paige disappeared, investigators openly acknowledged the limitations they now faced. In 2025, Lieutenant Matt Young of the Livingston County cold case team stated that the case would likely only be solved through a confession, a guilty party seeking to make things right, or the accidental discovery of Paige's remains during construction or road work. This statement reflected the harsh reality that evidence alone may no longer be enough. The investigation into Paige Renkoski's disappearance became not just a search for what happened, but a lesson in how quickly opportunity can vanish when time is lost. What began as an ordinary day ended with a mystery shaped as much by delay and assumption as by silence, and with each passing year, the truth became harder to reach. As the years passed without answers, the disappearance of Paige Marie Renkoski slowly transformed from an active investigation into a haunting presence that lingered in Michigan communities and in the minds of those who continued to search for truth. With no body, no arrest, and no clear explanation, the case entered a space where silence allowed theories to grow, not as solutions, but as reflections of unanswered fear. Investigators were careful to separate documented facts from speculation, yet public discussion inevitably filled the gaps left by missing evidence. One of the most persistent questions surrounded why Paige stopped on the shoulder of Interstate 96 in the first place. There was no confirmed mechanical failure reported with her vehicle, and the Oldsmobile Cutlass Calais showed no visible damage when it was later examined. Some investigators considered the possibility that Paige may have experienced an emotional moment that led her to pull over, especially given reports that she appeared upset when witnesses saw her speaking with the two men beside the maroon-colored minivan. Others questioned whether she may have been signaled to stop by someone she believed was offering help. A common and tragic vulnerability on highways, the presence of Paige's shoes inside the vehicle became one of the most unsettling details in the case. Shoes are not typically removed during brief roadside interactions, and their presence suggested that Paige did not plan to walk far from her car. This detail led investigators to believe that Paige did not leave voluntarily, with the intention of disappearing, reinforcing the conclusion that she was likely taken against her will. Her purse remaining inside the vehicle further supported this belief, as it indicated that she left behind items most people would not abandon intentionally. Witness descriptions of the two men in the maroon-colored minivan remained frustratingly vague. No license plate was recorded. No identifying marks were confirmed. The color maroon was recalled consistently, but beyond that, the vehicle remained a shadow in the case. Over time, investigators acknowledged that even if the minivan had been identified years later, tracing its movements back to that specific afternoon would have been extremely difficult. Public attention occasionally returned to the case through media coverage, anniversaries, and renewed searches, but each resurgence ended the same way, with no new answers. Families traveling along Interstate 96 past the stretch of road where Paige was last seen, often unaware of its history, while those who knew the story felt a quiet unease every time they drove by. The idea that a person could vanish in daylight on a busy highway challenged the sense of safety people associated with ordinary travel. For Paige's family, the silence was not abstract. It was personal and constant. They lived with unanswered questions, not knowing whether Paige suffered, whether she was afraid, or whether she had any chance to call for help. Each passing year without answers became heavier, especially as opportunities for closure faded. The lack of a body denied them not only justice but the ability to mourn fully. Law enforcement officials were careful in how they spoke about the case publicly. They emphasized that speculation without evidence could harm the investigation, yet they also acknowledged that someone somewhere likely knew what happened. The belief that Paige's disappearance involved more than one person added to the complexity, as crimes involving multiple individuals often rely on silence rather than secrecy to remain hidden. Fear became an unspoken part of the story. Fear that someone who committed a violent act blended back into ordinary life. Fear that the truth might never surface. fear that similar situations could happen again without warning. Paige's case became a reminder that danger does not always announce itself loudly, and that harm can occur quietly when assumptions replace caution. Despite the fear and uncertainty, investigators did not abandon the case. The Livingston County Sheriff Department continued to review files, re-examine evidence, and follow up on any credible lead that emerged. Advances in forensic science offered hope, but without new material to test, progress remained limited. Still, the case stayed open, a quiet promise that Paige had not been forgotten. The silence surrounding Paige Renkoski's disappearance was not empty. It was filled with unresolved questions, restrained grief, and the possibility that one day someone might choose to speak. Until that moment arrives, the story remains suspended between what is known and what may never be revealed. In the years that followed the disappearance of Paige Marie Renkoski, the absence of answers became a permanent presence for her family, for investigators, and for the communities connected to the stretch of highway where she was last seen. What began as an urgent search slowly transformed into a long vigil marked by anniversaries, renewed hope, and repeated disappointment. Yet the story never fully disappeared from public consciousness. Within weeks of Paige vanishing, large billboards bearing her photograph were erected along Interstate 96, placed deliberately in the very landscape where she was last known to be alive, and a total of 25 billboard advertisements were planned in an effort to keep her face and name visible to passing motorists. These billboards were more than advertisements. They were reminders. They told travelers that a woman had disappeared here in daylight, and that someone somewhere might hold the answer. Over time, as years passed without resolution, new billboards were raised again alongside images of other missing women, reinforcing that Paige's case was not forgotten and that authorities still hoped for information to emerge. Michigan Crime Stoppers continues to offer a cash reward for information related to Paige Renkoski's disappearance, a sign that even after decades, investigators believe the right tip could still matter. For Paige's family, the passing years carried a different weight. Without a body, there was no funeral in the traditional sense, no physical place to grieve, and no certainty about how Paige's life ended. In February 2018, a dual memorial service was held for Paige and her mother, who passed away in December 2017 without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. Paige's story has been documented repeatedly across time, not because it offers resolution, but because it continues to represent a failure of certainty in a world that depends on it. Major newspapers, television networks, and national missing persons organizations have revisited the case, each time presenting the same haunting facts and the same unanswered questions. Her disappearance has been examined in true crime literature, including the book Death of a Model by Clifford Leyendecker, where her case appears alongside others that demonstrate how quickly an ordinary life can be interrupted. Law enforcement officials have spoken candidly about the limits they now face. Without new evidence, without witnesses coming forward, and without the recovery of Paige's remains, the case exists in a fragile state where progress depends almost entirely on human choice. Investigators have stated publicly that the most likely paths to resolution would involve a confession, a guilty party seeking to make things right, or the accidental discovery of remains during construction or roadway work. This acknowledgement does not signal surrender, but realism shaped by time. What keeps the case alive is the belief that silence is not permanent. People change. Conscience can surface. Secrets can fracture under the weight of years. Someone may remember something small that once seemed unimportant. Someone may decide that carrying the truth is heavier than revealing it. Paige Marie Renkoski was not defined by how she disappeared. She was defined by how she lived, as a daughter, a teacher, and a woman whose life mattered. Her story remains unresolved, but it is not unfinished as long as it is remembered, shared, and treated with care. Every retelling is a refusal to let her become invisible. This story is real and documented through the Charlie Project, the DOE Network, the Detroit Free Press, the Lansing State Journal, CBS Detroit, NBC News, WDIV, Livingston Daily, the Associated Press, Michigan Crime Stoppers, the book Death of a Model by Clifford Leyendecker, and official statements from the Livingston County Sheriff Department cold case team, along with reporting that references searches involving the Federal Bureau of Investigation and state and local law enforcement agencies. This is Hidden Truth. If you stayed with this story, it means something inside you understands why these stories matter, because truth does not disappear just because time passes, and justice does not arrive unless people keep asking questions. So subscribe to Hidden Truth now, because every voice added keeps real stories alive, and sometimes the right story reaching the right person is the moment silence finally breaks.